Welcome to this guided tour of a short passage from St. Matthew's Gospel and a comment on it from St. Chrysostom. Here's a list of some resources I'll be referring to in these notes, and also options on the web for finding the Greek text and an English translation. Here are the two passages we'll read through, if you want to work through them before using my comments. Notice that the location of the passage in Schaff's Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers is different from Menia. Also note that the Greek uses letters for numbers, so beta gamma means homily 2, part 3. And in the version I've used from the web, the passage is on page 10. So let's begin with our verse from Matthew. Biblos geneseos Jesu Christou, Viu David, Viu Abraham. So our first word is Biblos. Notice that it's one of those feminine nouns that use second declension endings. Simply means a book, but Whitacre in his concise lexicon suggests the gloss registry due to the genealogy that follows. Our next word, geneseos, is a genitive modifying biblos. You can see it's a third declension. It follows pattern 5b of the third declension nouns and adjectives, and it means origin or generation. Not a generation, but generation in the sense of production, or it can mean birth. Now later in this chapter from Matthew, in verse 18, it does mean birth, as you can see from the quote I've given you. But here in verse 1, most translations and modern commentaries take the word as referring to the genealogy that follows, and so they translate it genealogy. For example, they might say the book of the genealogy. But neither Little, Scott, and Jones, that you can find in the Perseus website, nor Brill cite this as a gloss, and BDAG seems to indicate that this is an option primarily due to the genealogy that follows. In other words, this gloss is an application to the context instead of an actual meaning of the word, in contrast to the word genealogia, which does mean genealogy. Now, Whitacre in his large lexicon, BDAG, gives another option for the meaning of Genesis here in verse 1, though it also is not listed in the other lexicons, and that's based on the fact that the expression Biblos geneseos, in other words, book of the origin or birth or genealogy, occurs in Genesis 2:4 and 5:1. So Whitacre says that it could refer to an account of someone's life, and you could translate it history or life. And he goes on to explain that the expression Biblos geneseos in Matthew 1:1 is from the Old Testament, Genesis 2:4, 5:1, and in the former of these two passages it equals history of the origin, which some consider a fitting heading for Matthew 1. And he cites the old commentary by Theodor Zahn, and he says Zahn regards the expression as constituting a superscription of the whole book, and so he would translate this book of the history. That's in BDAG pages 192 to 193. The comment in the Net Bible is helpful for understanding the point that Whitacre is making there, and you see you can access this at net.bible.org. So they note here on Genesis 2:4 that the Hebrew phrase la toledot is traditionally translated as these are the generations of, because the noun was derived from the verb beget. Its usage, however, shows that it introduces more than genealogies. It begins a narrative that traces what became of the entity or individual mentioned in the heading. In fact, a good paraphrase of this heading would be, this is what became of the heavens and the earth. For what follows is not another account of creation, but a tracing of events from creation through the fall and judgment. This section extends from 2:4 through 4:6. So that's that first note there on the right, and the second note goes further on the same title. So Theodor Zahn, that Whitacre refers to in his commentary from 1903, which is available on the web, as you can see, at archive.org, takes this same sort of interpretation of the expression here in Matthew. And in fact, this is the interpretation Chrysostom promotes, and Zahn notes that in his notes. And we'll see Chrysostom work with this connection to Genesis 2:4, but he's also going to work with the meaning of Genesis. So we'll be paying more attention to this word as we go on. So for now, just hang on to the actual meanings of the word, and also this expression Biblos geneseos that shows up in Genesis. The rest of our verse, Viu David and Viu Abraham, are genitives in apposition to Jesu Christou. That's why they're all lined up flush with one another in the map. Both David and Abraham are indeclinable, and so in our text they're going to be genitives. So we have a book, or the book, of the origin or birth or genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Let's now see what Chrysostom does with this brief passage at the opening of Matthew's Gospel. So here's our first sentence. Tinos de heniken biblon autein genesaos kale Jesu Christou. Begins with tinos de heniken. Heniken's a preposition that takes a genitive. It also can take the form henika with an alpha on the end, and that's where you'll find it in lexicons. And notice that its object, tinos, comes before it. This is the common order for this preposition in Attic Greek, though in the New Testament its object usually comes after it, as with most prepositions. It means on account of or because of. So on account of what or because of what, or we could say why or how come. And the next word I want us to look at is autein. That adjective is the direct object of our verb kale. Autein is feminine because it's referring to biblon. And the rest of this sentence is a quote from Matthew 1:1, though its order is broken up from an English point of view, as you can see. So here's the line from Chrysostom with Matthew 1:1 underneath. So in other words, our first sentence here is, why does he call it a book of the origin of Jesus Christ? Now our next sentence. Kai toi geu tuta eche monon ten genesen ala pasan ten oikonomian. Kai toi is a combination of kai and toi. Toi by itself is an emphatic particle, meaning certainly or exactly or several other things you see there. And kai toi together is also an emphatic particle. It can be translated a number of ways, as you see from the short Little and Scott or the Brill lexicon. Deniston, in his large book on Greek particles, says that the more common use, or what he says commoner use, of kai toi is as an adversative which the speaker uses to introduce an objection, quote, which tends to invalidate or cast doubt upon what he has just said, or to make it appear surprising, or is in general opposed to it in tendency. And so Deniston suggests yet or and yet. Then we have another particle added. Ges, another particle that signals emphasis, and it's often combined with other particles to add yet further emphasis. Particles can be tricky to translate, but they're lots of fun because they're like the equivalent of gestures or intonation. So here we have something like although or and yet or yet. Then u is matched by the ala that follows. It's part of an u-ala construction. That's very common, not this but that. And tuta is the subject of the verb. And since it refers to biblos, which is feminine, we'd expect the form haute. But here Chrysostom seems to match the declension form instead of the actual gender. And so he says something like, and yet this does not have ucheche monon. That's the accusative form of monos. And the accusative here is accusative of manner. So it's functioning as an adverb, and you can find that usage discussed in the lexicons under the adjective monos. And yet, this book has not only ten genesen. Now Chrysostom is using a word that more clearly refers specifically to the birth, although it can also mean generation or production. So Chrysostom is asking why Matthew said his book is about the origin of Jesus, yet includes much more than just his birth. Notice that genesen is also a 5b third declension. So we have, and yet this book does not have only the birth, but all the oikonomian. So what's oikonomian? This word is based on the word families related to oikos, house, and nomos, law. So we get such words as economy and economics from it. We can see an example of its first sense in the parable of the dishonest manager in Luke 16, as I give you a quote there. But for our passage, notice especially the last set of glosses listed. Several times in the New Testament, and often in the Fathers, oikonomia is used of God's providential plan or design. In Ephesians 1:10 that I cite for you there is an example. Ephesians 3:9 would be another place. 1 Timothy 1:4. This idea is sometimes referred to in English as the divine economy. The expression is not referring to a financial system, but to the overall plan of creation, redemption, and recreation. Chrysostom's using it in that sense to refer to all the events recounted in the Gospel of Matthew. So we might translate this, and yet this book doesn't have only the birth, but the whole scheme of events. So here are our first two sentences, but in fact they would read more smoothly, I think, as a single sentence, replacing that question mark in the middle and moving it to the end. So we'd have something like, why does he call it a book of the origin of Jesus Christ, and yet this book doesn't have only the birth, but also the whole scheme of events? So now Chrysostom goes on to answer the question he's raised. Hoti, because. Hoti passes tes oikonomias ta kephaleon tuto, kai arche kai ridza panton hemin ton agaton ginetai. And you see the map is pretty simple. It doesn't have any prepositional phrases to sort out. So we just have two clauses. Passes tes oikonomias, the whole of the scheme of events, we have already met. And ta kephaleon. This word has a number of usages, as you see. The literal meaning of head or top occurs only rarely, since kephale does that job most of the time. I'm going to translate it as head for now, because we're going to wait and see how Chrysostom uses it here. The comma suggests we have two clauses, and that's how a couple of translations I've checked take it. And in that case, this then would be a predicate position, with tuta as the subject and ta kephaleon as the predicate complement, and we need to supply the verb to be. So we'd have something like, because this is the head of the whole scheme of events. And then our next clause would go, and beginning and root. Arche and ridza are both nominative singular forms. That's the actual lexical form, the lemma. And one means beginning and the other means root. So both the beginning and root, panton, hemin, ton agathon. Panton's going with ton agathon, and hemin would be a dative of possession, all our good things. And then ginetai would be our verb. Now arche can mean origin, but perhaps since it's followed here by ridza, Chrysostom's saying that the birth of Jesus is both the starting point of all of our good things and the source from which they sprout and grow. So basically Chrysostom is saying that the genesis, the birth of Jesus, is the genesis, the origin of all that follows. So our two clauses would read, because this is the head of the whole scheme of events, and it is or becomes both the beginning and root of all our good things. Now this is another place where I wonder if the text has been divided up correctly, because tuta usually takes a predicate position without being predicate. And I think this would read more smoothly as a single sentence, with that first part being the subject of ginetai. So we'd have something like, because this head of the whole scheme of events is or becomes both the beginning and root of all our good things. Next, Chrysostom grounds his interpretation in the use of biblos in Genesis 2:4. Hos per un biblion uranu kai geis kale Moses, kai toi ge u peri uranu kai geis dialecthes monon, ala kai peri ton in meso panton. Huto kai hutas apatu kephalaiu ton katorthomaton ta biblion ekalista. So our first line, hos per un, so just as, biblion oranu kai geis, a book of heaven and earth, kale Moses, Moses calls. So we need to supply a direct object. Moses calls it a book of heaven and earth. And then we have our expression kai toi ge again, although or and yet, and we have the u ala again, but now it's expanded to u monon and ala kai, not only but also. And again, that's a very common construction. Dialecthes is from dialego. It can be used in the active, but almost always it's in the middle. And remember, these theta eta forms can be middle or passive. If you want a reference to that, check out Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek, page 239 for some of that discussion. So we have, and yet, not narrating only concerning or about heaven and earth, but also narrating, understood, concerning everything in the midst of them. So everything else in between, as it were. So Chrysostom's picking up on that same usage from Genesis that Danker referred to in Zahn and the Net Bible Note. And now he applies it to Matthew. Huto kai hutos. So also this one. In other words, Matthew. Thus also this one, ta biblion ekkalisthe, named his book, or the book, the ta here could be his, named his book, apatu kephalayu ton katorthomaton, from the head, ton katorthomaton. So what is katorthomaton? It's another third declension noun from the ma words. And the basic meaning is success. And this word has almost an entire page in Lamp's Patristic Lexicon, which is a wonderful resource for sorting out what's going on in the Fathers, and can get at a lot of the thought of the Fathers because there's so many passages cited. And in our passage, the first meaning, success, fits, and Lamp gives some other expanded glosses, triumph, achievement, work. So putting this sentence together, we'd have something like, so just as Moses calls it a book of heaven and earth, although narrating not only concerning heaven and earth, but also concerning everything in the midst, so also this one named his book from the head of the things achieved. Now as we go on to our final sentence, that's going to help us sort out what Chrysostom means by head, kephalion. Ta gar ek plexeos gemon, kai hyper elpida kai prostokian hapasan, anthropon genesthai theon. Tutu de genomenu, ta meta tauta hapanta, katalogon kai akoluthian hepatai. So looking at the first part of our sentence, ta is going to introduce both the participle and the compound prepositional phrase to form the predicate nominative complement in an equative sentence, and the verb to be is left out. So we have for ta ekplexeos gemon. Ekplexeos, another third declension noun, meaning amazement or astonishment or fear, and gemon's a neuter participle for being full, and it takes a genitive. So ta is going with gemon to form a attributive participle or substantival participle, so that which is full of amazement, kai, and hyper elpida, beyond hope, from elpis, another third declension noun, kai prostokion hapason. Prostokia means expectation, and hapason from hapas, meaning all. So that which is full of amazement and beyond hope and all expectation. Anthropon genesthai theon. Genesthai are infinitive, taking the two accusatives. In this case, theon is going to be our subject. God becomes anthropon, man. So this infinitive functions as the subject of this equative sentence. And the context obviously indicating it's God becoming man instead of man becoming God. And the map has a single line since all we have is a complex subject and a predicate with no subordinate clauses. And usually I give you level 2 maps where I pull out the prepositional phrases, but here the prepositional phrase is part of the predicate nominative, and so it's left on the main line. So we'd have, for God to become man is full of astonishment and beyond hope and all expectation. Or to retain something of the rhetorical effect of Chrysostom's order, we could translate it, for that which is full of astonishment and beyond hope and all expectation is that God should become man. And actually the Greek order is even more powerful because the word God comes last as the climax, the most mind-blowing part of the whole thing. Then our final part begins with a genitive absolute, tutu de genomenu. This having taken place, in other words, the birth of Jesus in which God became man, ta meta tauta hapanta, that's the subject. Everything after these events or things, hepatai. It's a simple present indicative in the middle, meaning to follow. Notice we have a neuter plural subject with the singular verb as usual, so all the things after these things follow. And they follow kata logon kai akoluthian. according to reason and akaluthia. If you remember the verb akaluthao, you might notice the connection here with following, since akaluthao means I follow. So we can translate our prepositional phrase according to reason and order, or rationally and in order. But both words, logos and akaluthia, are very significant in the Fathers, for the Fathers see all the events from creation to new creation by way of redemption, expression that William Dumbrell used, as taking place in accordance with Christ, who is himself the logos. In other words, the rational principle of the universe that holds all things together. That'd be developing passages like Colossians 1:17 and Hebrews 1:3, and also orders them. And so everything is interconnected, both in salvation history and in creation and in the scriptures, and it all follows in a certain order. So we might translate, this having taken place, everything after these events follow in keeping with reason and order. So the birth is the head, the kephalion, of the entire scheme of events, in the sense that it's the chief point on which everything else hangs. Now, in fact, all the events of Christ's work are essential for our salvation: his birth and life and death, resurrection, ascension, the sending of the Spirit. If any one of those is left out, then we have nothing left. There's no salvation. But we can appreciate Chrysostom's point, because the most mind-blowing, the most unexpected part is that God has become man. And once that's happened, then anything's possible. Everything in the divine scheme of events flows from that reality and is organically connected to it. So as always, it's a good idea to reread the text a number of times after you've worked through the details, so you begin to get comfortable with what the Greek is doing and pick up the meaning in the order that it comes. Biblos geneseos Jesu Christu, huiu David, huiu Abraham. Tinos de heniken biblon autein geneseos, kale Jesu Christu. Kai toige u tuta eche monon tein genesen, ala pasan tein oikonomion. Hoti pases tes oikonomias to kephalion tuto, kai arche kai ridze panton hemin ton agathon ginetai. Hosperun biblion uranu kai ges kale Moses, kai toige u peri uranu kai ges dielechtheis monon. Ala kai peri ton in mesopanton. Huto kai hutas apatu kephaliu ton katorthomaton ta biblion ekaliste. Ta gar ekplexeos gamon kai hyper elpida kai prostochion hapasan anthropon genestai theon. Tutu de genomenu ta meta tauta hapanta katalogon kai akalution hepatai.